So far with the custom Navi cards, we've seen the Sapphire Pulse card, which we rather liked, and the MSI Evoke OC card, which we rather didn't like. And today we're going to look at Sapphire's higher end card, the Nitro Plus, which is launching today, and it's coming in with higher clocks, higher power, and a bigger cooler compared to the Pulse card. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see what it can do. Pricing is still a little up in the air, but we reckon it's going to come in at $449 in the UK, and that looks like it's going to take on the power color Red Devil directly. So it'll be an interesting comparison when we get to that review, which will be very, very soon. Now, as for the Nitro Plus card, the initial impressions are pretty good. The build quality is really rather nice. It's very solid, very weighty. It's around about 1.1 kilograms. It's got a nice solid aluminium backplate and a generally sort of tone neutral aesthetic. That's quite an important point to note because for this card, Sapphire has actually included some addressable RGB lighting for the logo here, the edge of the backplate, and also the back of the backplate on this logo here. So it's going to be a pretty good looking, quite a bold card. And they also have a little connector here, which allows you to hook it up to a motherboard for addressable RGB control. Now, as you can see, size-wise, it is a bit of a beast. It comes in at over 300 millimeters long, it's 135 millimeters tall, and it does take up 3 slots. They call it a 2.3 slot design, but obviously on your motherboard, you're going to need 3 slots to accommodate it. But other than that, let's look at the specs. Looking at the clock speeds, the Nitro Plus card is the fastest we've seen so far, with a voltage frequency curve that is clearly shifted quite far compared to reference and even compared to the Pulse. However, these are the same reported clocks as Power Color's Red Devil, so Sapphire isn't alone in targeting this level of performance. As usual, there's no memory overclock, but the core overclock is expected to drive up power consumption by a substantial 40 watts compared to reference, so let's hope that the big cooler can cope. With that power limit in mind, it's not really a surprise to see that Sapphire has changed from a 6-pin 8-pin combo to a dual 8-pin combo. Now this gives the card technically 375 watts of available power, so plenty to cope with that increased TDP. They've also deviated from the reference design in terms of the display outputs because they're using 2 HDMI and 2 DisplayPort instead of the 3-1 split. Now the reason for this is to do with VR. It means you can have a VR headset and an HDMI display connected at the same time. Not a big deal, but useful for a certain subset of users. The other thing they've included that wasn't on the reference design but was on the Pulse is a BIOS switch. Now this is actually a 3-way switch instead of 2, which it was on the Pulse. It comes with a performance BIOS, which is the default, a silent mode, and then a software control mode, which allows you to tap into the Tricks software that Sapphire also provides. Here's what the difference between the performance and silent BIOSes actually looks like. We're comparing GPU only power here, not total board power, hence why we've moved from 265 watt to 220 watt, but a 25 watt difference here is still substantial, and you'll see how this plays out shortly. Now I've already mentioned the ARGB lighting, but something else to note is that these 3 fans can actually be upgraded to ARGB fans. So if you want to add a bit more RGB to it, you can, and that's going to cost you about £29. That comes with all 3 fans. And Sapphire is still using its quick disconnect system, which I'll show you in a minute, and this makes it really easy to swap the fans in and out. I think this is a pretty good feature because it means that if you want that extra RGB, you can have it, but if you don't want it, you're not paying over the odds just to have a feature that you don't need or want. With that said, we're going to tear the card down now and take a closer look at the cooler and the PCB. So starting with the fans, you can see obviously it's a 3-fan design. You've got 2 95mm fans on the outside and a middle 87mm fan in the middle, which spins in the opposite direction to the other 2 as a means of trying to reduce turbulence between them. The airflow comes out the top and the bottom of the card, so it's going to come towards your motherboard and a lot of it's going to end up in your case. Now, as I mentioned, they do have the quick disconnect feature on the fans, which means you just need to take out 1 screw here and each fan can come out nice and easy. Just pops out like so. Now, I think this is a really cool feature. It's not like everyone needs to do fan maintenance from time to time, but it is perhaps one of the more likely components to fail. So if it ever does, you know, it's an easy way to deal with it. And also if you want to take the ARGB upgrade that Sapphire offers, it's a very easy method to install. I should also mention that this card does come with a 0 RPM fan mode, and so below 60 degrees or so you're going to see the fans turn off completely. It's a feature that we do like to see, but if you don't want to do it, you can probably play around with the fan curve in Wattman and keep the fans running at all times. Right, so with the cooler off, we can see what's going on underneath. So they have a large copper contact plate using thermal paste, and it looks like they've got pretty good contact. This is feeding 5 separate heat pipes connected to 2 different fin stacks, one small and one large. And this larger one is also calling the MOSFETs of the GPU VRMs directly via some thermal padding. The heat pipes are nickel plated, giving them a nice consistent shine, and Sapphire isn't really wasting any volume as far as we can see, so it looks like it's filling out the card nicely, making use of all of that space. Now, as you can see on the PCB, there's a separate cooling heatsink for the memory, and this is one of the largest memory coolers we've ever seen, and it's separate, decoupled from the main cooler, but it's still going to benefit heavily from the airflow, especially of the fan over here. So I'll whip that off, and you can also see what's going on under there. So with that removed, we can see that it's being used to cool all 8 of the GDDR6 modules, as well as actually the MOSFETs of the remaining VRMs, so the 2 for the memory and the 1 for the memory bus here. Now MSI, if you happen to be watching, this is the size of memory pad you should be using on your card. You can see that it offers full coverage for each of the GDDR6 chips, so this is a really good design from Sapphire. A quick word on the PCB, Sapphire has moved from 7 to 8 power phases, a slight upgrade, not really a big deal, and it's also using its black diamond chokes, which come with a range of claimed improvements. Not going to be really looking into those, it's not really possible, so that's all you really need to know. Let's crack on with the testing. The clock speed plot shows that this is the fastest 5700 XT we've looked at so far, which is to be expected from the on-paper numbers. Sapphire is very close to the MSI Evoke OC here, but overall it does maintain a higher average clock speed that is in the 1925 MHz range, though this is going to vary from card to card and is not set in stone, especially as our labs are not temperature controlled. We've also plotted the silent BIOS, which is at roughly reference card levels or just above. While clock data is interesting, performance is what really counts, and while 3D Mark will only ever be an indicator, its granularity is useful for demonstrating the likely impact of average clock speed differences, especially between cards with the same GPUs, and here it really isn't very much. It's games that really count, however, and as usual we're limiting what we show for the sake of your time and our sanity. The card blitzes through 1080p, so we're focusing on 1440p, but the full suite can be found on the website. Metro is our first and toughest game, and a 99th percentile result of 36 FPS here pretty much guarantees smooth gameplay in the vast majority of titles. Performance here is great for AMD, as it's 15% faster on average than an overclocked RTX 2060 Super, even though the difference between these two cards is only 6.5% overall. Shadow of the Tomb Raider shows how little real-world difference there is between the various partner cards. Overall, the Nitro Plus is less than 1% quicker than MSI's Evoke OC and about 1.5% faster than the original Pulse card. The average difference over reference is thankfully a bit more at 5%. The card maintains 60 FPS consistently in the Division 2, but a look at the average performance makes it clear that Nvidia hardware does better here. Across the full selection of games, the RTX 2070 Super maintains a 4.5% lead over Sapphire's Nitro Plus card. The last game we'll show you is Total War 3 Kingdoms, which is again Nvidia-centric. The RTX 2060 Super Founders Edition, for example, is within 1 FPS of the Sapphire Nitro Plus, but overall the latter card is faster by a healthy 12%. Even though we're looking at total system power consumption here, the figures still scale nicely with clock speeds and performance. Truth told, Navi isn't very efficient when it comes to increasing clocks, so this is the price you pay with higher overclocks. That said, there is a very clear difference between the performance and silent BIOS, with the latter reverting to reference levels of power. In terms of temperature, the Nitro Plus seems to target around 70 degrees, which gives it a difference over ambient here of 48 degrees. This is very healthy and a massive improvement on reference, and even though it's not as aggressive as the MSI card, the difference in fan noise is astounding. Fan speeds hover between 1400 and 1500 RPM, which is really rather quiet on this triple fan cooler. The other good news is that VRM and memory temperatures are lower than the other cards, despite the quieter fans, illustrating the effectiveness of Sapphire's cooler design. What's also interesting is that when you switch to the silent BIOS, you actually see a reduction in temperature, and this is primarily because of the lower power consumption. This means that throughout the card, temperatures go down, and this includes the VRM and memory, so you're getting a quieter and cooler card by switching to this BIOS. Obviously, you're then running without the overclock, but in terms of real-world performance, it doesn't actually add a huge amount, and if you're happy with the reference performance, this could be a viable alternative to the performance BIOS. We weren't able to add anything to the clock curve when overclocking, but simply raising the power limit to the maximum value of 150% was enough to see a decent increase in clocks. We had the memory at 935 MHz, the equivalent of just under 15 gigabits per second. This gave us an improvement of 4 to 5%. We technically managed better results from our Sapphire Pulse and MSI Evoke OC samples, but really the silicon lottery is going to play the biggest part in determining how well you get on. The main thing to remember is that overclocking on Navi is heavily power limited, as this graph demonstrates. More power means more heat, so if you want to overclock and don't want to watercool, focus your attention on the best cooler designs rather than chart-topping results from individual and possibly pre-selected samples. So there we have it. Now, Sapphire already had a pretty good card with the Pulse, but with the Nitro Plus, I'd say it now has an excellent one. Obviously, it's a huge improvement over the reference design, but even compared to the Pulse, it is slightly faster and it's quieter and cooler as well. And it also implements some tasteful ARGB lighting with the option to control it via your motherboard and also upgrade the fans to match. It's also very well made, and it has a properly implemented multi-BIOS solution, and we also like that it has the 0 RPM fan mode. So really it's quite hard to fault. If I had to nitpick, the size is going to be a bit problematic for some users, and I'd also say that it would be kind of nice if they labeled the BIOSes in terms of positions, but again, very minor detail. And one other thing would be perhaps increasing the warranty to 3 years in the UK to match MSI. So that just leaves the pricing to discuss, and as we said at the start, this should come in at £450, which is hopefully something that the retailers are going to be able to stick to. Now in the UK it's going to be interesting because that's actually only £10 more than the Pulse card retails for, so probably a pretty easy temptation for users to just spend a little bit more and get the higher power card. That's also going to put it directly in competition with the Power Color Red Devil, which is the card that we're going to be reviewing next, so do be sure to subscribe if you want to see that review. The value next to competing Nvidia hardware is also pretty good, so really we don't have many complaints at all, and this is really quite a fantastic effort from Sapphire, and perhaps the best £450 card on the market, but we'll come to that in our review of the Red Devil. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you then.